Hello, everyone. This is the 169th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview English author Mr. Jim Keoghan discussing his book, Is It Just Me or Is Modern Football an Expletive? An Encyclopedia of Everything That Is Wrong in the Modern Game, published in 2021. Mr. Keoghan is also the author of the following books: Punk Football, The Rise of Fan Ownership in English Football, High Lows and Bakayokos, Everton in the 1990s, Everton number nine, nine players, one iconic shirt. How to Run a Football Club, the story of our national game, life in the English game from top to bottom, post punk football, and everything you wanted to know about Everton, but were afraid to ask. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be
Thank you.
here.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Well, I think like a lot of people, it starts at a young age. You kind of first love football, you start playing it. So I kind of played it all through my kind of youth years and into kind of my 20s as well. But obviously, then you start supporting a club. So kind of, I think my first game was going to watch Everton age maybe 5 or 6, kind of in the early 1980s. And I just absolutely love that. And obviously, that's a relationship that's lasted since. I've remained Evertonian. I don't live near the ground anymore, but I go to games when I can. It's always been like a massive passion of mine. And then eventually I kind of got into football writing as well to kind of deepen that passion, I guess. So I've written, as you mentioned, about 10 books on the sport. So it's something that I love it. I play it, I watch it, I write about it, I coach it. So it's an all-consuming passion of mine.
Let's get to your book. Can you describe the contents and the format of your book and the duration it took you to write it?
So I mean, it took about 6 months to write, and it's structured as a kind of a encyclopedia, I guess, of kind of a to Z to cover a kind of all those, I guess, the minor irritations that of modern football, and kind of I guess each one alone isn't that big a deal. It's just something that kind of mildly irritates you, but I think collectively, I think they form a narrative of a game that has changed quite a lot from when I first began watching football to the kind of sport that we experience today. It's been a dramatic change, probably the biggest change in the history of the sport. Possibly for fans of a certain age, maybe kind of 40 plus, who have kind of lived through that transition. There's maybe the sense that these kind of minor irritations can add up to something that is quite unsettling, kind of a change to kind of the magic of the sport that we loved. I guess kind of what does that mean for football, really?
Did you really have to think hard for some of the topics, or were they more or less topics that just noticed over the years and had in the back of your mind irritated you?
Yeah, I should have thought hard, but I didn't. They were all just there, just kind of it's. I know, and also once you start, it just kind of came in like a torrent. There's so much there that you almost don't realize how
Yeah.
much because I think because you love football, you put up with a lot. It's the sport you love to kind of play and watch.
Later in the interview, there are things that you didn't even mention that irritate me, so I'm gonna run them by you to see your
Yeah.
opinion on those. So, like exactly as you said, this is a book that will resonate with the fans of a certain age. Although done in a light manner, is there an underlying serious indictment of the modern game?
Yeah, I think so. I think I mean, if you look at maybe football in the 1980s and compare it to football in, let's say, the 1950s, they're broadly similar. Obviously, the game had changed a bit, but actually, even if you look at football in the 80s compared to the 1930s, it's still recognizably as kind of, you can still recognize it as the same sort of sport. If you look at football in the 1980s and look at football in 2025, the change has been dramatic and huge. And I think there's maybe a sense that the way the game is organized, who it's run for nowadays, as maybe it's starting to rob the sport of some of its magic. And there's the sense that maybe the people who build football, the fans, are maybe not always at the forefront of the minds of the FA, FIFA, UEFA, the broadcasters, the clubs themselves. And we often feel that, we're getting priced out. Kickoff times don't suit fans. The way grounds are organised or moved often kind of rob games of their atmosphere. So this huge change that's taken place, like a lot of it driven by television. As I think it's in some ways it's improved football, but in many ways it's starting to create a very different sport and one that is in many ways unrecognizable to the sport that I first fell in love with in the early 1980s.
As I was reading, there were some common things that most serious older fans disdain, but there were also some that I had not even realized. What was the trigger that made you to write this book?
Weirdly, half scarves. I found, when they kind of first appeared in the game, to me, it's such a, like an affront to what football is. When you go and like you can go to a Merseyside derby and see Liverpool and Everton half scarves. You can see like Liverpool and Man United half scarves, and you're thinking that people are going to these games. These fellas wouldn't sell them if there wasn't demand for them. So it's kind of who's going to watch football? Who's going just are you going just to be entertained by something? Where's the sense of rivalry, of passion? It's kind of that to me is such a kind of illustration of what football is slowly becoming. It's kind of driven by tourists, driven by television, where fans are being priced out of the game. It feels like if you want to point to one thing to kind of illustrate the problems with modern football, I would start with half scarves.
It feels that many of the topics that are touched on are direct results of the fact that we live in a mass media age of television and online world. Is this the main reason you feel for most of the changes?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think TV in particular has radically altered football, not just in this country, but everywhere. I think TV has kind of, you can point to the kind of the massive inflation in wages, in transfer costs, in club debt and instability. You can pinpoint that to the arrival of kind of TV money into the game. You've also got the sense that games are now structured for a different kind of audience, particularly neutrals. Whereas once all that mattered to a game was the fans who went. Now you feel like what matters more is that massive neutral audience at home, and that is shaped, kind of reshaping football. Greater emphasis, kind of every rule change has made football more attacking. That's for that TV audience. When you hear narratives in the English game where a team who plays kind of open, breakneck football, like for example Luton last season in England, were praised because that's what neutrals want to watch. Whereas a team like Everton, who were dogged and boring and hard to watch, they were kind of dissed in the media because that's not what neutrals want. You got the sense that football, it's kind of its kickoff times, the way it's structured, the way it's organized, it's built for this kind of TV audience, and this and that kind of those TV revenues at the same time have brought a massive degree of instability into football. I don't think if you look at, for example, prior to 1992, very few clubs in this country went bust. And yet you've had this massive influx of money from TV, and you'd imagine more money would help the game, but in fact the opposite happened. It's made it much more unstable, and it's created a sense of elitism too. You've got those at the top creaming off most of the money at the expense of those at the bottom. So I think it's been probably the most damaging thing for football in most countries, but particularly in England, where I think money and TV's had the greatest impact. All the ills, I think, from that you kind of associate with modern football, you can trace back, I think, to 1982 and the arrival of Sky TV.
For you personally, do you remember when you noticed that something was wrong with the magical rose-tinted football of your youth? And is this reason one of the topics that you have listed?
Yeah, I think for me, the first time I noticed something was kind of guess changing or something was wrong with kind of the football that I went to was I think with price changes. When I was my son's age, he's 16 now. When I was that age, I could go and watch Everton and it would cost me about £2 to go, which was kind of it was okay, as a teenager, that wasn't a lot of money. Probably nowadays that's the equivalent of say maybe a tenner in kind of modern British money. In the kind of the mid to late 90s, you get this kind of creep where suddenly tickets are suddenly it's not £2, it's maybe £6, and slowly it increases. And now you reach the point now where for a young fan to go to the game, you look at maybe £35 to get a ticket, which is it's beyond the means of most young kids. And so that was kind of for me that was the first moment that this game that's always been reassuringly cheap, being a kind of working class sport that pretty much anyone can go and afford to get to. Suddenly, you've got people who are thinking, well, I can't really afford to go to every game, or I can't afford to go to any game, and I certainly can't take me kids to every game because you're looking at maybe, £100 plus. That to me was the first moment the sense that actually something's changing here. Football's becoming something different, and that trend that you first saw in the kind of the mid 90s has just exploded. And now football's a sport that is increasingly middle class, I think, in this country, kind of driven by corporate interests a lot. And the people who made the sport and who kept it going for over a century are kind of increasingly priced out.
Let's discuss some of the topics that you raise. I think these few are related. You have a topic called a bigger, better World Cup, the UCL, and the European Super League. So these are once beloved tournaments that are getting bloated and more out of control. Is this trend going to continue to be worse and worse as the decades pass, you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a sense of they really want to kind of sweat the asset. That's the kind of the feeling you get that there's no limit to how many games they want to be on TV, and that they'll try and expand these tournaments as much as possible, or bring in new ones, or expand existing ones. And there's definitely a sense that they'll do this at the expense of players, at the expense of fans, at the expense of older competitions. So in this country, there's definitely a feeling that the European competitions now take priority over things like the FA Cup. So you're seeing old competitions kind of diminish in importance at the expense of these newer ones. So I don't see that changing. I think there seems to be kind of the demand for football seems to kind of, they can't exhaust it. So those who run the game are just going to look for more and more ways to kind of put football on TVs. I'm not sure where it ends, whether players eventually kind of go on strike and refuse to play in so many games, because there has to be a point where players can't play anymore. There has to be a point where they just can't fit in this many games if it keeps increasing. But at the moment, it feels like the TV audience it's there. So these people who are only interested in making money, they're bound to kind of try and find games for that audience.
I grew up in an era where the European Cups were a knockout format. And there was such excitement with the Champions Cup, the Cup Winners' Cup, the UEFA Cup. And because of economic reasons that we discussed, the Champions Cup eventually evolved into a Champions League to such a point where the Cup Winners' Cup was disbanded in 1999. And the UEFA Cup now has become a meaningless tournament. The Europa League and the Conference League, I don't think many people watch it anymore. And personally, the moment I noticed some it was getting out of hand was during the 1999-2000 season. I don't know if you remember where the Champions League became before it had slowly they had been tweaking it season after season. They had a group format. Eventually they said, okay, we're gonna have the runners ups participating. Then at this season, they started, okay, depending on the nation, you can have three, four teams. So you had a situation where you had like two group rounds and then the knockout rounds. And that was a moment where it's like I realized like these are just too many games. It's getting harder and harder to follow. For me,
Yeah.
that was the moment I was like, okay, we're officially at a point where there's just too many games. Something has changed.
Yeah.
And this whole discussion about the Super League that's been in the news in this last few years, the existing Champions League, it already is somewhat of a Super League anyway. I think when this whole talk started, there was some journalists who estimated that season by season, I think like up to 80% of the teams are the same from season to it's always the same things. Man City, Real Madrid, Paris Saint-Germain in the Champions League. And that doesn't seem to end any day soon.
No, I think you're right. I think there's possibly kind of a sense of momentum towards kind of, if not kind of the European Super League as it was first envisaged when they kind of tried to break away, that maybe ultimately football will end up like that because there's so much money to be made from European football. And I think increasingly people seem to follow these super clubs. Kind of, you see it in this country, the concentration of clubs like Man United, Liverpool, Man City, Chelsea, they dominate. And I think kind of for young kids kind of coming through, who would you rather watch? Would you rather watch Chelsea play Real Madrid, or would you rather watch Gillingham play Millwall? And I think, increasingly that's where the glamour is. So, it's not something I particularly like, but I can see a point in the future where there will be, where the European league, kind of European level league, will take dominance over domestic leagues. I think that's where football is going. I think there's kind of a fight against that amongst kind of older fans, but I do wonder long term if this is just where we're going to end up.
In a similar vein, other topics include Nations League and this Club World Cup tournaments that I don't know a single person who likes these tournaments or cares about these tournaments, but somehow they're here to stay. As far as the Nations League, it seems like they're just these glorified friendlies, and the only people who seem to like these are the punditry class, who I guess like them because of professional reasons. But honestly, I don't know a single other person who likes these tournaments.
No, it's rubbish. The Nations League is. I mean, I get why they did it, and because often kind of the old international friendlies, you get ridiculous matchups. You get like England against San Marino and stuff like that, kind of almost a pointless game. I get why they did it, and I get why they kind of did it in a kind of league format to kind of give it some excitement. But actually, international football outside of tournaments, it's boring. I think a lot of fans are really turned off by it.
It's
So it's
gotten to that point. It didn't used to be. It's gotten to that point.
yeah, and I think like in many ways they were flogging a dead horse because there's not much interest there. When England are on telly and they're playing a Nations League game, you're never going to get the same impact as if they're in the Euros or the World Cup. It's just not comparable. So people are just desperate during kind of the international break for the Premier League to start again. That's going to once the season starts, you don't want to be bothered with England or Scotland or France. You just want to watch your team. So I get the reason for it, but it's terrible and it's boring because I think that kind of football is just tedious and nobody really cares.
A topic that you mentioned that is one of my pet peeves is exiting early. This is when fans leave the stadium, let's say in the first half, when their team is losing badly. Can you explain how this type of attention seeking started? Was it always a thing, or did I notice it just in the last decade, maybe, let's say?
That's a good question. I don't know. When I grew up, you stayed to the end, and there was a
Yeah.
sense that, like, sometimes, like as a younger fan, I actually thought if you slugged off early, you might get abuse from your kind of fellow fans. Sometimes there are reasons, like a lot of kind of modern stadiums in this country are being planned very badly. So actually, you do sometimes have to leave early. So somewhere like, for example,
Yeah, but those are for traffic reasons. I'm talking
yeah,
about like
oh
their
yeah,
team is losing like three
oh
zero
yeah,
in the first half, and you see fans leaving the
yeah.
stadium, and
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's kind of, I don't know, maybe there's a sense of entitlement now. You've paid so much money, you want to be entertained. If you're losing 4-0 at half time, you're not getting value for money. I don't know. It's a weird thing. I always think it's, even if you're getting battered. I've been at games with my son where Everton, because it's Everton, haven't been doing very well. And we've always said, you've got to stay at least
yeah,
until the 80th minute because you've come this far, you support the club.
yeah.
But maybe that's an old-fashioned view. I don't know. I think your club needs your support even if they're terrible. But maybe if fans are changing. Maybe thinking if I'm paying 60 quid, I'm not going to sit here and watch garbage pointlessly. And you just get off. I say football's changing. Maybe what fans are willing to put up with has changed as well.
Your section on going topless. This is the kissing the badge, and that's something I had noticed in the 90s as well. It seems to have dissipated somewhat, do you think, or am I not paying enough attention?
I think it's still there, but you still see it occasionally. I think players know now if they do all that kind of stuff and then leave, it's going to look ridiculous. So you do still see it. You still see people kind of pumping. They'll pump the badge. They'll kind of do that, and they'll, or
Uh,
they'll hold it up, not necessarily kiss it. There's still all that kind of. It's pantomime. It's
right,
performance.
this, yeah,
It's all that. Yeah, exactly. I think as fans we see through it. We know what it is. I mean, players. There are definitely some players who love their clubs, but players, it's a job, and they can move on or be sold.
yeah.
And their affiliation is often temporary. I think as fans we know that. So I don't think it works anymore. When players do, I just think you think like, I'll just get on with it. Just celebrate your goal and just keep playing. Don't do all that.
And I remember like it was maybe late 90s, early 2000s. Michel Platini mentioned this in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he says something like, it gets to be ridiculous when you see a 22-year-old who's already playing for his like seventh club. He does this.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is ridiculous because the nature of football is players move on. Often they want to move on, or they're sold. So all this kind of, we do it for the fans. I think most fans see it as just kind of bullshit. We don't really kind of buy into it at all.
When it comes to VAR, I think you could have written an entire book on it. What is the future of this?
Well, one is here to stay. I think it's weathered its initial storm. I mean, it was absolutely hated. I mean, I can only speak for this country, but it was hated when it first came
It
in.
seems to have been, I guess, applied the worst in England, it seems like.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true. The standard has been exceptionally poor. The mistakes have been so frequent, which haven't kind of helped things. And I think, when it initially came in, it was definitely at a very rocky start, largely because, as you said, it's been done so poorly in this country. You have kind of a handy kind of illustration because in the FA Cup early rounds, there are games that don't have VAR. So in the recent round, there was some real kind of terrible refereeing mistakes that would have been corrected by VAR. So you are getting kind of examples now where fans can say, well, actually, maybe it wasn't that good beforehand because referee. There was a game, I think it was Man United, that's kind of scored a winner that was kind of just horribly offside, awfully offside. VAR would have corrected that. So maybe now we're getting more used to it and we can see the benefits. And I think whilst it's not loved, I think if it was maybe applied properly in this country, it would have more respect. I think in England the problem is that just artificials in general. The quality is so poor in the Premier League that it's in games and in VAR, it's just littered with mistakes and accusations of bias. And I think our issues are not just VAR. Our issue are our referees aren't very good. They can't control games. They don't seem particularly professional. The standards are quite low. Yeah, so I think it's here to stay. You can see in the future it becoming like they had in the World Cup, where you take more and more decisions out of the hands of kind of humans, and you make it more kind of AI, and you make it kind of more automated. And then the less human element there is, I guess, the more correct it becomes, and maybe that then VAR becomes kind of more accepted. I don't know. Yeah, I think in this country, certainly it's more about its application than it is necessarily about the kind of technology involved.
As far as your section of kits, there's a whole online industry of fans for kit nostalgia. But obviously, the whole modern kit industry seems to have gotten out of hand with teams having a multitude of kits per season. What will be the evolution of this, do you think, in the future?
I think again it goes back to that kind of that idea of sweating the asset. I think clubs like TV companies recognize that fans are there to be exploited. Your fans have kind of limitless love for their club, and one way to show that is to buy merchandise. So I can recall when kits would change every 2 years. When you couldn't buy away kits, it was just you'd buy like one Everton kit and keep that for 2 years. Now Everton will put out a new kit each year, a new away kit each year, a third kit, an array of kind of different training tops, and they'll have different themes that come out during the season. You could probably buy about 8 tops if you're that way inclined. And obviously people do, because the clubs wouldn't do this if the demand wasn't there. So as long as fans keep putting their hand in the pocket, clubs are going to find new ways to exploit their love. And one of those is merchandise.
I seem to remember, let's say a team like Juventus, they would, I would say for like maybe 70, 80% of their matches, they would wear their home kit. And on the rare occasion, they would have the away kits. But nowadays, you see teams more and more wearing their away kits in with more regularity, even if they don't need to really.
Yeah.
There's no color clash or anything, but they have to, I guess, for commercial purposes, they have to at least use the kit. So And
Yeah,
then special kits for like the Champions League matches,
yeah,
special kits for like FA Cup,
yeah,
so
yeah. And fans keep buying them. So we're like, you can't, you might not like it, but you can't blame a club for saying we need to raise money. We've got these fans who will buy anything we put out. Clubs are going to keep doing it.
let's discuss the very pleased to meet you. This is the pre-match high-fiving like 5 minutes before they're kicking the lumps out of each other. Is this as phony as empty gesture as it gets?
Yeah, pointless, absolutely ridiculous. Again, done for TV, done so it looks respectful. Like it didn't exist prior to
Yeah, it's like
Sky.
I seem to remember, but like again, I grew up in an era where the teams would walk onto the field, the captains would shake hands,
Yeah,
and at the end of the match, the players
yeah,
would shake hands and exchange kits.
yeah.
But now they enter the field with child mascots. I don't remember when that started, like a row of children holding hands with the players. This was
Oh
not a
no.
thing, I don't know
No,
when it started. Yeah.
it was one mascot, I think, for the home team would
Yes,
come out
yes, yes,
and
that's
go
true.
to the centre circle with the captains. As you said, they would shake hands, and that was it. And at the end, at the end, you'd shake hands because that's kind of sportsmanlike. But this whole kind of beforehand stuff, again, it's
Yeah.
making it a pantomime. It's for TV. You get the
Right.
Premier League logo or the Champions League logo, a bit UEFA, a bit of Premier League. You shake hands, and it looks all respectful. And then the
Right.
whistle goes, and they start kicking lumps
Yeah.
at each other and swearing at each other. You could remove it and it would make no difference to the game. It is
Right.
total pantomime just for TV. And again, it's a little thing and it's not a big deal, but it's irritating. Why do we have this when we didn't used to and the game was absolutely fine without it?
Other sections that I want to bring up are rallying cries and, like I said, that deal with communication with media and fans. Are they just as scripted as they sound?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the rallying cries is, I think, that's something that, as a kind of Evertonian, we've got used to. It'd always be the case that if we went on a losing streak, then around the kind of fourth loss, Seamus Coleman would come out and do like, "This isn't good enough. We understand the fans. We're going to give
My favorite,
100%,"
we need to look in the mirror or something like that. Yeah.
something like that. And then, yeah. And then they go and lose the next game. You're thinking, well, what was the point of that? It's absolutely meaningless. It should be a given that they look at the mirror, that they get what the fans are kind of upset about. So I think they're pointless. I think a lot of kind of the post-match interviews tell you nothing at all. Players they're often media trained now, so they'll try through the same banal responses, don't offer you any insight. I mean, they don't come out angry and swearing or kind of,
Yeah.
losing their rag. It's like a lot of kind of, like, it's almost like a lot of punditry. It's just noise that tells you nothing about what you just watched. And again, you could remove it. You could not have rallying cries. You could not have post-match interviews. And your experience of football wouldn't have altered. You don't need it. It's the 90 minutes that matter. And as fans, you know what you've watched. You've followed this club and this game long enough to understand what you've seen. You don't need a player to go through a 2-minute interview where he says absolutely nothing at all to kind of make the game experience kind of more exciting for you. It's just noise for TV.
Other interesting sections include boots, celebrity referees, fan TV, glory hunters, half and half scarves that you mentioned before, inked up, and stadium naming rights, just to name a few. Are these symptoms of the modern game of mass media, etc.?
I think so. I think it's kind of at the start a lot. Again, they are very minor irritations that, if taken alone, you think, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's collectively, it's kind of
Right,
forming a very different football. I mean, to me, football used to just be going to match with your mates, watching a game, and then talking about it afterwards, and that was football. There wasn't this whole kind of circus around it. You
right,
didn't have things like halftime entertainment. You had
right.
quiet. You could just talk. You didn't have pre-match things. You didn't even have punditry. It kind of, when I first began watching football, all this noise around it that has kind of sprung up, I think, largely for television, that has created a kind of a very different sport. And I might just sound like an old man moaning, But I thought a lot of the magic of football is kind of slowly being chipped away by kind of these changes. But maybe if you're 15, 16, maybe you don't feel like this. This is just football to you, and maybe you like these sort of things. But I think for a lot of kind of people who've kind of gone through that change, who had a foot in both camps, who experienced the older form of football and experienced modern football, they feel like, well, actually, maybe some of these things collectively kind of illustrate a very different kind of game starting to emerge, and one that maybe is not as good as it was.
I grew up in an age where all the players' boots were black. You
Yeah.
had the rare exceptions where, like, you had George Weah having the red boots, Diadora boots, or maybe Enzo Schifo as well. But nowadays you have players with, like, I don't know, orange, purple shoes, sometimes two different colors on each shoe. And again, that's kind of getting out of hand. You have this whole Sweet Caroline at football matches, which that was not a thing I don't remember
Oh,
ever.
horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible. That is, yeah.
And things like this non-celebration against your former team. I don't, that's also relatively a new trend. I think.
I think that's right.
It's
I think it's kind
yeah.
of like, again, it's rooted in that whole kind of respect thing, maybe linked to kind of the pre-match handshake. It's about kind of how you appear. But I don't mind players who played for us celebrating
Yeah.
against us, because you play for the team that you play for. You can
Yeah.
still like another team, but if you're paid to play for that team and represent those fans, and you score a goal for those fans, I think you should celebrate. You don't have to be a
Right.
knob about it. You have to go overboard, but you think all that
Right.
kind of calmness, that's ridiculous, I think.
Something I've also noticed recently, I noticed, like, during the team huddles, you have cameras, like, in going inside and actually recording what the coach is saying to the players and things like that. And to me, I'm one of those people who think that this is kind of should be like sacrosanct for the team
Yeah.
privacy and things like that. And it's something that doesn't compute with me. But
Yeah, I agree. And I think in this country, they're looking at maybe having things like talking to managers at half time, and like,
right,
getting
right, yeah,
getting their
that's
inside. You're thinking, we don't need to know that.
yeah,
It's their job. Let them do their job. We don't need to be involved. We don't need to know what's being said in those huddles. It's like, let's leave some magic about the
right,
game.
right, yeah.
Like, again, the game has functioned fine for years without us knowing what the manager thinks at half time. Again, a lot of changes for the sake of it, or again, for the TV audience. I don't know. You feel like they're just kind of messing around with football at the moment, and not every change they make, it doesn't necessarily make it better.
As you mentioned, many of these topics are just minor annoyances.
Yeah,
But do they signal a trend that might ruin the game?
I suppose it depends who you ask. I think what age you are. These things that I find annoying, my son who's 16 only finds some of them annoying. So there are definitely things as a young lad, he thinks that's ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing that. That's a waste of time. But there are some things that he thinks, well, that's fine. That's just what football is. There's a danger you just sound like an old man railing against change. But there's an overlap there where fans, I think of all ages, do find some of these changes. Some of them are just stupid. And why are you doing that? And some of them, maybe you feel like they're kind of spoiling the game. You see that, I think that's kind of felt by all fans with something like the FA Cup in this country, that every change they've made to that competition, we think to kind of accommodate the elite clubs in this country and their kind of European schedules, has diminished a kind of a cup competition we should be very proud of. It's a fantastic competition that disperses funds across the game, which gives small clubs the chance of kind of a cup run, or knocking a big team out. It's the magic of the cup, but it's being changed, and each change is just a minor change, a minor irritation, but collectively it's doing something quite kind of pernicious, and it's ruinous. So I think that's felt regardless of your age. So there's definitely kind of areas of overlap there, that it's not just men over 40 whinging because football isn't like it used to be. There are areas of consensus where a lot of fans think, whether it was the European Super League, but it's the ruining of the FA Cup, whether it's kickoff times, where the changes you're making, it's not right, and you're not putting the game or the fans first.
There are certain topics that were not discussed in your book. and I would like to run them by you and hear your thoughts. I'll start with this whole concept of XG. This was not in our lexicon, I don't think, even 5 years ago. Or
No. I mean, what's it really? I mean, what's it mean? Really? Like, you still like, I think with this last season with Everton, with Sean Dyche, we were kind of losing games, but our XG was really high. Who cares?
yeah.
You know, you lost all your games. You know, great that our XG was like 2.5. We lost 2-0.
I mean,
It's
other than a punditry class, does anyone even care what XG is?
I suppose they think it's a sign of underlying performance, or but I don't care. I think you go to watch your team win, and if you win with one shot, you've won. That's
Yeah.
kind of what matters. So yeah, I think it's just more noise, pointless noise.
Another particular annoyance of mine is, I don't know if you've noticed this, the short corner. I don't remember if they were as prevalent, let's say, in the 80s or 90s when we were watching football. And to me, like a corner kick is like a dead ball situation. It's an exciting aspect of a game. And I seem to notice players these days tend to go with a short corner more often than we were used to. Have you
Yeah.
noticed that? Or
Yeah, I think it's very pep ball. Certainly in this country, it's kind of, I think it's linked with also the kind of the dominance of now playing out from the back. It's kind of you want to do kind of possession, pep football. You don't just launch it into the box. You don't just launch it to a big man. You play kind of proper football. I think it's just a trend right now in this country. I imagine in the same way that you're starting to see a slight difference now in England, where you're getting kind of teams like Forest who will play a different kind of football. They're more direct, and more physical. And you've seen Arsenal this season have kind of set piece coaches, and they'll put balls into the box. Maybe as kind of the era of Pep and Man City diminishes in this country at least, maybe you'll see a return to, proper corners, and not just kind of, and proper kind of football, not just this kind of obsession with playing out from the back, with playing it short and kind of Pep ball. I think we're just in kind of been living through the Pep era, I think. That's maybe coming to a close soon.
another thing that really annoys me is, on free kicks, when you have the one player behind a wall laying down horizontally to block all the ground level shots, that I recently learned is called cocodrilo. Again, I grew up at an era where you just had people standing in front of a wall. You just didn't have that. And just the probability of ground level free kicks are remote anyway. So
Yeah.
it's a small thing. It kind of annoys me. I
It is a
don't know if
small thing. I think because there was a time we didn't have players with the technical ability to exploit a wall jumping. I think now you've got players who are good enough for the first time, who are, so talented from kind of dead ball situations. They can time their strike for when a wall jumps. But as you said, it's very rare, isn't it?
yeah.
It doesn't, the goals from those sort of strikes. I think maybe because they make a team look so foolish. If you concede from a ball under the wall, you just look slightly ridiculous. But then is that any more ridiculous than having a player lying down? I don't know. So it's I don't know. It's definitely a modern thing, yeah, but I think it's a reflection that actually kind of dead ball takers are a lot better than they used to be, I think.
Yeah. Another annoyance is this new trend. I don't know when it started. Players interrupting a victorious manager's press conference, where they come in, celebrate, they pour champagne on him.
Yeah.
Like, again, this was not a thing. I don't know when.
No. I don't know when that started, but it's kind of I suppose if you say you don't like it, you're seen as kind of the fun police. But I think it I do,
Yeah.
yeah, I know what you mean. It isn't, again, it's a minor annoyance, and maybe
And
it's
it's
just a
become a
personal one.
tradition. That's the thing. It's become a
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah.
Yeah.
And now, yeah, maybe you're seen as not as much fun if you don't do it. So you've sort of got to do it, and
Yeah.
it's yeah, I don't know. I prefer just to kind of keep things separate. But
Right.
again, I think it's just modern football. That's just kind of what's expected now.
This other thing, I don't see it as much anymore, but a few years ago, this was like the rage where when a new player would join a club, they would have to do for their initiation ceremony, they would have to sing a song in front of the whole team, and they would record it and put it on social media. That seems to have dissipated, but that was a thing for a while too, if you remember.
Yeah, well, I think kind of initiation rites in general were part of football for quite a long time. I think they've
But the
generally died
public
out.
didn't see it. I mean, that was
No, I think
restricted to the
no.
team, you know?
He was, yeah, and it was kind of often it was kind of like low level, low level bullying. So
Yeah.
it's kind of maybe it's a good thing that it's died out, really. But I think that the song one's probably better than some of the older initiations, which are kind of they were just bullying. So the song, at least the song one, you just look like an idiot for a few minutes. But yeah, I think in general now, kind of players don't put up with that kind of stuff. The whole setup is more professional, I think, now than it once was. Maybe that's one change of one football that is a good thing.
As someone who grew up with the magic of the whole mystique of the Ballon d'Or, nowadays it's become this like a ceremony, like a gala event, like the Academy Awards or something, and you have multiple trophies for different categories. And again, during the old days, you'd have the best player in Europe. You'd have the journalists select them of various nations in Europe. You didn't have like a voting by the captains, voting by the managers, and things like that. I mean, there was always controversies, but it seemed to be more objective and more serious. But now it seems to be not what I remember, let's just say.
Yeah, I think it's a much bigger deal than it used to be, I think, as well. There's much more noise about it than there once was. And like a lot of things in football, there's just more stuff associated with it. Like I can recall not really being aware of the Ballon d'Or when I was a young fan. I didn't, it just seemed vague and not important. But I think now for a lot of fans, it's kind of it's quite a big deal.
Yeah,
And
I
if it
think
plays,
perhaps in England it was kind of like maybe more off the radar, but like obviously in the rest of Europe it seemed to be a big deal.
oh yeah,
Uh,
it was I think typical English just kind of dissociate themselves from Europe. But I think it was yeah, I think it was not a big deal at all in this country. I think obviously that's changed now. As a fan, if a player from your club wins it or gets in kind of the top three, it's seen as like a massively important. But it's just I think you're right. There's just more noise around it than there used to be. There's more kind of bits to it. But isn't that true of like all of football? There's just more football, there's just more stuff, and they can't ever seem to just leave things alone. Just they've got to just add,
mm.
tinker, and do more stuff to it. But it's but then you say the Ballon d'Or, it's wildly popular, isn't it? It's become a huge deal. So whatever, I guess from their point of view, whatever changes they've made, they probably see it as a success because more people, even the English, are now kind of into it, which is wouldn't have been the case maybe 20 years ago.
So another annoyance is this ridiculous debate of the social media age, the comparison between Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. So you have fans in each camp, young or old. They will post the merits of one and the shortcomings of the other. I've always said this. The truth is that as fans of this age, we should be lucky that there are two players of exceptional quality who are contemporaries and who have marked their generation. But
Yeah.
there's this ridiculous, like, you see it all the time on Twitter, like this one's rubbish, the other one's rubbish. And I'm like,
Yeah, you're right. You should be lucky that you've experienced two of the greatest players in football history in the same era. But people just can't stop competing. That's just I think that's modern fandom. I think is more competitive maybe than it used to be. There's no sense of kind of respect for the other camp, for the opposition, for a different opinion. But you're right. It should be the case that actually they are both two exceptional footballers that we've been lucky to witness.
just broadly speaking, in fact, there's more trolling online, it seems like.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah,
so.
definitely. I think it's especially online, it's a much more aggressive space. Football, it's made football a much more kind of aggressive, intolerant arena than it once was. The days of like I can recall when my dad was a kind of young fan, he would go and watch Everton one week and go and watch Liverpool. But it was football. It didn't really matter. Wasn't a Liverpool fan, but the idea that no fan would do that now. I mean, you couldn't get in, but no fan could do that now because you just hate the
Right.
kind of people there. And I think social media definitely kind of accentuates that. It's a really aggressive space where people are just, I mean, people are awful. I tell you, I've encountered that with kind of, you write something about an opposition, and the abuse that you get in return at times is just horrific. And you're thinking, I don't think that was the case 30 years ago. I could be wrong, but I think people were a lot more respectful of the opposition. It was less a cauldron of hate than I think it can be nowadays. That's definitely, I'm sure there were fans like that, but it does feel like there's more of them nowadays.
A constant topic that I've discussed on my podcast, on my blog is the devaluation of football magazines. I don't know about you, but I grew up with football magazines, and to this day it's my passion to read those old football magazines. And it seems like, I guess, just because we live in the internet era, because of the abundance of the internet and social media, that has somewhat died down, the whole football magazines business. And I've mentioned this before on the podcast. Growing up, I used to run to the kiosks to get the latest issue of this magazine or that magazine. That no longer seems to be the case. Definitely not for the younger new fans.
No, no, definitely not. I think when you've seen it in this country with like the death of the fanzine, you once go to grounds and you have fans producing their own little magazines that were always like absolutely fantastic, really funny and really informative, and you're getting the fans' point of view that was so much better than the match day program. But you've now got fan TV. I think that kind of for a lot of supporters that kind of sates that kind of that demand. You can That's how you experience football. You don't need to buy 442. You don't need to buy a fanzine. You can go online and watch people like you talk about football, and it's easy to access. Often it's free. And I think that kind of fan-led media has exploded. It's certainly in this country over the last kind of 15 years. I think that's where a lot of fans want to get their information and increasingly just get information about their team. They're less interested in other teams. They want to know more about their team and what's going on and kind of every bit of information possible. And you get that increasingly from Fan TV.
And a lot of times these magazines were like really the only access we had to information for a while, to
Yeah.
football news. But obviously on Twitter, you can go on Twitter in 5 seconds, you'll see all the news of the day in football.
Yeah.
So
Getting information about other leagues used to be difficult. It used to be
right,
hard work.
right.
You'd have to kind of, just to search highlights was difficult and, information about kind of other leagues. Now it's so easy. You just,
Right.
in a touch of a button, you can find out anything you want about any division, any team in world football. It's so much easier. So do you really need a magazine for that? Probably not anymore now.
I think we kind of touched up on this somewhat, but the whole slow death of international football really needs to be underlined. Again, this is something that was an exciting part of the game. I used to like look forward, check lineups to see, who the new caps are. Like you would always kind of like peek out like this is a new name for the national team, things like that. There would be maybe like one match per month, let's say, and it was a main event. Now, like an international break, you have like 3 or 4 matches in the space of like, I don't know, let's say 10 days. It's created a situation where the normal fan has a disdain for the international breaks, and they're
Yeah.
looking forward to for league football to resume.
Yeah. I
And
think,
that did not used to
yeah.
be a thing. That did not used
I,
to be a
I,
thing.
no, I think, and disdain's a great word. I think that's kind of what it is. Kind of, I think you will tolerate international football when there's no other football on. So if you have a tournament in June and you haven't got your kind of, your weekly football, you can get enthusiastic about it and you can get excited. And you still see kind of World Cups and
But
Euros and
but when it was like maybe you had like one match a month, let's say for a qualifier,
yeah, you
you
can. I think
that was something you would look forward to. But now you're forced to watch 3 4 matches, like I said, in a
it's not interesting.
yeah,
In some ways it's slightly unfair on international football because it can't compete. It kind of once the season starts, people are so passionate about their clubs and so into it, and then suddenly it stops for a week, and then
yeah,
they give you this inferior form of football. How can it compete? It's just
yeah.
it just it, and I don't see how they can ever solve that because actually they cannot compete with domestic football. You don't have that same level of passion. I think for your international side, it's just not. You might want them to win, And maybe in tournaments you can kind of manufacture that passion, but actually, comparing for me, comparing England to Everton, it's just not compatible. I just once Everton I've started playing, I do not care about England. And
No,
give me three England games in a week, it's just too. I don't. It's more stuff that I don't want. So it's
no,
you're right. I think disdain's a good word. I think it's kind of that's where, and that's I don't know. It's probably a problem they can't solve, really.
yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. On a similar vein, the Euros have kind of been ruined. I grew up in an age where Euros was only 8 teams.
Mm.
And obviously that was a problem, and they decided to extend the Euros with the 1996 edition to 16 teams. And that seemed like a fine balance because 8
Yeah.
was too little. 16 seemed like a fair balance of a number of teams competing. But then they started having like 24 teams from 2016 onwards, where roughly half the teams in Europe are participating. And you have like third place teams. Increasing quantity does not necessarily equal increasing quality.
Yeah, I think exactly. But I think again, it's TV, isn't it? They want to broadcast as many games as possible. People still watch them because I think if it's on, you'll watch it. Not necessarily enthusiastic, but if it's on, you'll kind of
Yeah, but it doesn't have the
no.
same excitement,
No, it doesn't because I think it feels bloated. I think that's kind
Yeah,
of when it first starts, and actually with these tournaments, I think it tends to get really exciting when you get towards the end where it's only a handful of teams left. That's when your kind of interest really peaks. Early on, you're sort of half watching. I think when games are on, you're sort of a bit on your phone, thinking, "Oh,
yeah.
these aren't going to make it," and I'll watch a bit of this, and you're not really engaging in the same way you are during the latter stages of a tournament. But again, I think that's just modern football. They want to bloat everything they can to put on as many games as possible. And as you said, they're not really interested in quality. They are
No.
interested in quantity. I think there are diminishing returns when you start adding more and more elements to anything, really.
Continuing in me sounding like an old man, another annoyance is I've noticed this in recent, let's say last decade, is there's this trend of a group team photo in the changing room after an important win. And like I said, in the past, like the dressing room is like a sacred area for the players that really the public really shouldn't have access to. But
Yeah.
now there's got to be the official group photo that they release on the social media after win. Again, it's a symptom of the new social media age. But I don't know if you've noticed that or
Yeah.
over
Yeah. I
like the
mean, just more access in general. You see these programs now. You see like on Amazon, Netflix, where you'll follow a team for the whole season. You'll see behind kind of behind the magic curtain, and you'll see kind of what's going on. Again, not something I ever really cared about. I don't really care what happens behind the
yeah,
scenes. And if a team wins the league or a cup, and you have a kind of you see the post-match celebrations, that's one thing. But if it's just a game, it's just a game. Why do you need
yeah.
to? But as you said, they need to create content. They need to put things out there. And I suppose what else are they going to do? You're seeing much more behind the scenes stuff than you once did because football clubs and leagues have to compete for your attention, and that means creating content.
And there seems to be another thing I've noticed is there seems to be more overexposure of the preseason friendly matches, which are kind of meaningless matches. In the past, no one would take them seriously because you know that by the end of the let's say the month, the team is radically changed because of the
Yeah.
transfer deadlines and things like that. But there seems to be more television coverage and exposure
Yeah.
of these matches.
Yeah.
If you notice, I don't know.
Yeah, but people will watch them. I mean, I'll watch or go to Everton games in pre-season, and they're crap. They're
Yeah,
absolutely rubbish. They're terrible. I remember watching with a friendly this season against Shamrock Rovers, and the game was abysmal, absolutely abysmal. And the Everton team that got put out in at the starting 11, unrecognizable to the team at the start of the season. Just kind of
yeah,
bit
yeah.
part players.
Half
It's
the team is transferred out by then.
Yeah, it's kids. And they're trying stuff out, and I think Everton drew that 3-3, and you're thinking it was just a terrible 90 minutes of football that gave me absolutely no joy whatsoever. but I still watched it. So it's as long as there are fans out there who are, who are willing to sit there and watch rubbish like that, I guess clubs are gonna put these things out there. But you're right. I think in the past pre-season, you would go to it. I think, well, not everyone would, but people would go to games, but it wouldn't be televised, and
Right,
people.
right.
And I think people recognize it as it's not that important, and it maybe the last two friendlies matter because that's more like the team you're going to see. But actually, early on, it's just fitness and we don't have to worry too much. But I think people get engaged much quicker now. They want to kind of, when July comes around, they want to get back into football. And I'm that way. I want Everton back as soon as possible. And when I start watching things again, and I'll sit through terrible, terrible games of football joylessly because it's just my club.
Another thing I've noticed, again, I could be wrong about this. This whole concept of walk of honor, I seem to
Yeah.
remember like this was a thing in Spain. This was a tradition in Spain where when a team would win the league title, let's say for their next match, you have the opposing players applaud them entering the field. I know it was a thing in Spain. I don't know if it was a thing in many other countries or it was a thing in England,
Don't
but
think it was. It is now.
yeah,
Yeah.
but not only that, now you have it for like I don't know, like the kit man or who's served the team for like 30 years or things like that. That the public probably doesn't know who that person is, but they
No.
do these gestures and it seems to be more prevalent these days. Uh
Yeah, I think
yeah.
when Liverpool won the league recently, they were getting kind of guards of honor. It wasn't even just on like the last game; it was every game after they'd won the league, which was kind of really kind of eking it out. And you're thinking, I don't recall it being a thing in the past. I mean, I guess maybe on your last game of the season, if you're the champions, maybe it's okay then for the to have a kind of a type of honor. But actually. I don't know. Again, it's pantomime, isn't it? Does it mean
Yeah.
anything? Do the opposition really respect you as champions? Is this just for television? It just seems another addition, like the pre-match handshake, where you're thinking,
Yeah.
if you took it away, is it any less respectful? Is the game any less enjoyable? Probably not. So why'd you add it in the first place? But it seems to be part of football now, and that's just the way it is.
Another trend that maybe on your end you may not notice, but maybe I notice because I live in the United States is this concept of I guess the Johnny come lately football fans. They always say football is a game that kind of gets in your blood when you're a young boy and it stays with you for the rest of your life. But you have this trend of, I guess, soccer it becomes trendy. You have this kind of older fans who magically become fans, and more often than not, they become fans of the English Premier League because of its marketing strength. And again, these are fans who probably have limited knowledge about the history of the game and the teams, but it is what it is, I guess.
Well, I think what we tend to get is more kind of what we call glory hunters, which are people who kind of maybe come to the game late and they will pick a team not based on any family connection or
Right.
geographic connection. Look at the league table and say, I like Liverpool, I'm a Liverpool fan, and that's it. And you're thinking that's kind of they're often, I mean, it may be unfairly, but they're often looked down upon by kind of fans who've been following a club all their lives and who've their association was drawn from a family member or going to their first
Right.
game or because it's the nearest club. The sense of people just kind of coming to football late, looking at the table, putting a finger on it and saying, right, I support Man United. I don't think they ever earn much respect. I think, and when you kind of
Yeah.
when you quiz them, you always think, oh,
Right.
that that's not good. So, but yeah, they very rarely turn out to be like Brentford fans or Brighton
Right.
fans or fans who've gone
Of
through a
course.
struggle.
Yeah.
They choose the kind of path of least resistance and choose someone who's going to win trophies right away. So yeah, I think you want football to be inclusive, and if you come to the game late, I think that's okay. But I think you'd like someone's connection to a club to be rooted in something more than just I want to win trophies.
So let's say English fans, do you notice that trend within international fans that they suddenly become fans of the Premier League?
Well, I think, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, 30 years ago, I don't think English football was internationally as popular as it is now. And
Right.
there's certainly fans from far-flung places who will just kind of pick a Premier League team. But in some ways, I mean, like, often these fans are getting up at like 2 in the morning to watch them. So they're not going to the game, but they're putting in the effort to watch the team.
Yeah.
It's just what tends to happen is it's not, these fans are not generally picking the clubs from the bottom half of the table.
Right,
That's the kind of
right.
thing that I find frustrating. It's kind of, and that might be due to marketing and how
Of course.
strong certain clubs are in certain territories. But it's when you look at kind of maps of where Premier League fans are based and kind of who they support, it tends to be Arsenal, United, Liverpool, Chelsea. They're not supporting Leeds, Everton, Aston Villa,
Right,
Brentford,
right.
Notts Forest. It's kind of, you feel like they're kind of getting into the league and they just want to follow a team that's going to be exciting, that's going to
Yeah.
be in the hunt for trophies. And like, I think a lot of English football for a lot of fans is that the suffering is part of the experience. And I think we think it's character building. It's good for you, and you shouldn't just go, I want to win trophies. It's about much more than that.
It's even worse when you see like Hollywood celebrities, they kind of jump on the bandwagon. Again, at a late age, they start liking soccer, and sometimes they'll go to matches, and they probably have no sense of the history of those clubs,
Yeah.
but
And it's always
and
the same clubs. They're not going to watch Millwall. They're not going to
right,
watch Crawley. They're going to watch Liverpool. They're going to watch United. It's like
right,
it's always the same six pretty much
right,
that
right.
they pick. So you're thinking, what's the connection here? Is it that you love football, or is it that you love a certain kind of football, a football where there's going to be trophies as part of the equation, not just kind of decades of mediocrity and disappointment, which is what most football fans go through.
In closing, I can look through my old magazines from like 1970s and 80s, and there's this common thread in fans and even players of past generations looking back at the good old times. Do you think it might be the same for our generation, where in time there will be so many changes that the current modern football in its worst state might look nostalgic? Or do you feel these problems discussed will be just as bad decades later?
It's a good question. I think, yeah, I think you'll always have that. I think that's, and then there's always a danger of that as a fan that you are just saying football was better when I was young. I know for a fact that football in the 80s had lots of problems. It wasn't perfect. I know I can moan about modern football, but actually, there's no, we had problems with violence in the 80s. Football wasn't that good to watch at times. The pitches were terrible. The facilities were awful. So you have to be careful when you look back and say, you look through rose-tinted and say that was better. And I think that will happen. Fans in 30 years' time will look back and say, "Oh, do you remember the good old days of the 2020s when football was this, football was that?" Especially because a lot of the things we've talked about, I think that trend will continue. I think there'll be greater concentration towards European competitions, maybe even European Super League. I'd see prices getting more expensive, clubs being run more on corporate lines, television becoming more powerful, the game becoming more bloated. I don't see how that changes, to be honest. So, like, yeah, I think there'll be a time when this will be seen as a golden age, really, by some fans. And it won't just be about nostalgia, it'll be because football has got genuinely worse. I think that's quite pessimistic to think that, but I can see a situation in the future where, working class kids just cannot watch football live anymore in the Premier League. They can go and watch lower down, but they're completely priced out of top flight football, where our great cup competitions are eroded to the point of being obsolete, where a handful of big clubs dominate supporters in the way that happens in Spain, where Real and Barcelona dominate supporters. That might happen in this country where you get the top six just dominating at the expense of everyone else. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Part of it will definitely be just nostalgia that everyone experiences, but equally, I think the way football is heading, I can see all these problems we talked about, all these minor irritations that are kind of symptomatic of something else. I think I can see this trend. It's only got worse over the last 30 years. There's nothing in the game to suggest, both kind of domestically in England or at Europe level or international level, there's nothing to suggest that anything is going to change. I think the kind of the all the main players in the game who've created this form of football today all want this to continue. So the television companies, UEFA, FIFA, the FA, Premier League, La Liga, less so the Bundesliga, but all these players want greater elitism. They want more money. They want TV wants more influence. They want more games. That's what football is going to become. So it's yeah, I think there will be people today who are 20, when they're 50, will look back and say, "Oh, do you remember how great football was back then? Now look at it." That's just the way we are, really.
With that, I would
With
like
that pessimistic note, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to Mr. Keoghan's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. And again, this is the book. Is It Just Me or Is Modern Football an Expletive? An encyclopedia of everything that is wrong in the modern game. It will either make you laugh or boil your blood, depending.
That's okay.
So, but it's a very good read and enjoyable read. And there were many things that fans of a certain age will notice, but there's also other things that maybe they may not have noticed. That's why I would urge everyone to read this book. It's a fun, good read. So, Jim, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
No worries. Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you.